This is the next in a series of videos on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Hope you find it helpful. Today we're looking at section 2 of the poem, A Game of Chess. The previous videos looked at the wasteland with an emphasis on the poem's elementals. In that game of chess, this interpretation will take a bit of a backseat before resuming in section 3. As to why in a poem that heavily features the four elements and their universal significance, there is an absence of the elementals here, I believe because this section entirely takes place in the city. In looking at the poem's other sections, you will notice that these sections take place either in nature and the city, or solely nature. Section 2 is unique in this regard, and just as the modern city is largely devoid of nature, it is reasonable to have an absence of the elementals in the city and Section 2's city. Now Section 2 does have an elemental to be covered later. Let's start with the title, A Game of Chess. Depending on what copy or edition of The Wasteland you have, it either won't explain the title or it will, the latter providing a reference to Middleton's A Game of Chess, or Middleton's Women Beware Women, or both. FYI, both of these titles are plays. In Notes on the Wasteland at line 138, Eliot calls our attention to Women Beware Women, not the Game of Chess play, so let's look at the former for this section's title. In Women Beware Women, a chess game acts as a diversion for Lincio's mother for access to Bianca. Lincio's mother has been put in charge of Bianca, wife of Lincio. Lincio has his mother promise to keep her locked up while he's away, fearing Bianca's beauty may attract other men to her. It's through this that a man, the Duke, does see her. The Duke has Guardiano and Livia work together to pull one over Lincio's mother so that he can get to Bianca. So with the game of chess, Livia distracts the mom away from Bianca. Guardiano distracts Bianca away from her mother-in-law by showing him around the house. Once Guardiano has gotten her far enough away, the Duke enters. When this play is staged, the audience can see the Livia mother-in-law and the Guardiano Bianca the Duke scene simultaneously, and the chess moves sardonically mirror the moves the Duke makes against Bianca. How's this pertinent to section 2? The mother-in-law welcomes Livia in as a friend, but Livia works against her. Remember this for the pub scene. The chess game is something civilized, but underneath the veneer is something ugly. While the motions between the Duke and Bianca mechanistically resemble love, it's only mechanistically that they do, for it's not love that's happening. This is similar to both the Livia mother-in-law dialogue and the chess game, the former really being a one-way conversation, only the mother-in-law conversing while Livia is speaking to keep her attention, the latter because the chess game moves being mechanistic and limited. It's not a real battle, where chess beautifies or at least civilizes what in reality is ugly, i.e. war. Also, don't forget with the chess game and this section, we're dealing with human relations, not nature or the elementals. This aside, if we think on the chess board, after having read section 2, certain things make it an appropriate image for this section. Like the Stetson hat, the chessboard is a sign of civilization. It's culture, it's cultural, it's sophisticated. Yet when we look at the chessboard, it's a rather sterile item. I imagine most chess sets are plastic and mass-produced. Most in Eliot's time might not have been made of plastic, but something else like wood. Across ages, some chess sets can be very beautiful, like those made of glass. Even so, glass is a sterile product, especially coming from the four elements and their universal significance. Sterility, as we'll see, however, is at home in the modern city and in the wasteland. There are things I want to add, but I'll do so when we get far enough in this section. Before we look at our first lines, I'll do something different here. Most of the text in lines 77 to 96 is an allusion to Cleopatra from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Let's look at the text Eliot alludes to first. She's a most triumphant lady, if report be squared to her. When she first met Mark Antony, she pursed up his heart upon the river of Cydnus. There she appeared indeed, where my reporter devised well for her. I will tell you, the barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes. For her own person it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold of tissue, over-picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. On each side her stood pretty dimpled boys, like smiling cupids, with divers colored fans, whose wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks, which they did cool, and what they undid, did. O rare for Antony! Her gentle woman like the Nereids, so many mermaids tended her in the eyes, and made their bends adorings. At the helm, the seeming mermaid steers, the silken tackles swell with the touches of those flower-soft hands that yarely framed the office. From the barge, a strange invisible perfume hits the sense of the adjacent wharfs. The city cast her people out upon it, and Antony, enthroned in the marketplace, did sit alone, whistling to the air, which, but for vacancy, had gone to gaze on Cleopatra too, and made a gap in nature. When we think about Shakespeare or his tragedies, Antony and Cleopatra isn't toward the top of the list, yet it does have some beautiful lines, such as in this scene, relevant to our purposes. First, it plays a love story, despite being a tragedy, like Tristan and Isolde. Second nature, from the natural to the man-made to the supernatural, is a complete attendance to her. Also notice our water and wind references, healthy symbols and healthy relationships to the natural and human world. Lastly, Cleopatra is this larger-than-life figure. Even if someone couldn't tell you anything else about her, everyone has heard the name Cleopatra. Compare this with the first lines in the game of chess. Chair she sat in like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble, with a glass held up by a standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eye behind his wing. Doubled the flames of 7 branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it. From satin cases poured in rich profusion, in vials of ivory and colored glass, unstopped or lurked her strange synthetic perfumes, pungent, powdered, liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the scents and odors. Stirred by the air that freshened from the window, these ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the laquiaria, stirring the pattern on the coppered ceiling. Huge seawood fed with copper, burned green and orange, framed by the colored stone, in which sad light the carved dolphin swam. Matheson, if you read The Achievement of T.S. Eliot, says that this scene starts off rather luxurious and magnificent, but most of us would agree with this. The text has throne, marble, jewels, satin cases, perfumes, and ornate decorations on the walls and ceilings. Matheson also says that the first scene of something misses the word synthetic, which when we think synthetic, we think artificial. Others might say the first bad sign is that we don't know the identity of the woman who's surrounded by this magnificence, that it's quite strange to have a titleless person of seeming high luxury. While yes, that she's nameless is literally the first bad sign, I think it's only one we can see in hindsight. I doubt anyone's ever read The Wasteland for the first time and got suspicious of line 77, even if he or she recognized the reference right away. And contrary to Matheson, I believe the first bad sign is earlier, in line 81. In line 80 to 81, we have the 2 Cupids, the first peeping out, the second hiding his eye behind his wing. Cupid is a traditional figure, so if the luxury and magnificence was traditional, or beautiful, or substantive, there would seemingly be no reason for a Cupid to hide his sight behind his wing. Also, there's a bit of irony. Some traditions have Cupid as blind, yet this Cupid is intentionally not seeing, so what he must be seeing must be bad. So the second Cupid doesn't like what he sees, and this helps us understand why the first Cupid is peeping out behind whatever cover he's behind. So what's the problem? The luxury isn't real. It's synthetic. I created this table to further illustrate the difference between the natural and the synthetic from our references. This table doesn't have everything, since I'm excluding lines 104 through 110 of the poem. In the first row, notice a reference to water. Our healthy life symbol has been removed with the absence of barge. In the second row, the perfume and the wind work together for this lovesick effect. Yet in the wasteland, the perfume is overpowering, seemingly to the point of being sickening. Third row, we go from gold to this burned green and orange, which reminds me of the chrome color, which is supposed to look like gold, but looks gaudy. Fourth row, the Cupid already discussed. Fifth row, we go from the imagery of beautiful supernatural water creatures to pathetic dolphin carving. Fifth row, there's the flower-soft hands that contrast with the gold and design cut into the glass, fruited vines held up. I think the rod is both in reference to the intricate design, so initially positive, but in hindsight is negative, suggestive of effort. In sixth row, Antony's absence is described as leaving a gap in nature, while the frame is used to bring nature into the dwelling. So a few more things. Remember that in this poem, allusions and references to fire are usually negative in keeping with the vegetation rituals detailed in my first video. If the Fisher King is sick or dead, the land becomes dry, and the Fisher King needs to be returned to health or life for water to appear and replenish the land. At lines 77, 82, 91, and 95, we have our fire references. The barge is missing, being replaced by a chair. The candelabra's reflection is doubling the flames. The synthetic perfumes are fattening the flames. And the copper frame is described as burned. Also notice we go from water in Shakespeare's play to abstract/sterile liquid at line 88. Keep in mind we don't know who this woman on the chair is. So far the perfume is more of a main character. We know the perfume is 1. Synthetic, and 2. Overpowering, so much of both that it's 3. Flammable. There might be an irony in the perfume being described as drowning the senses and being flammable. The gust of wind, notice our wind symbol, is described as freshened from the window. It's freshening, but in the room it wafts the perfume to the flames, fattening the flames. Beside Cleopatra, there's an allusion to another famous woman, Dido. In line 92, there's Lequiaria from the Aeneid, Book 1, line 726 to 727. FYI, a Lequiaria is a beautifully paneled wooden wall. As for the scene, it's when Dido welcomes Aeneas to Carthage after fleeing Troy. The room therein is wonderfully lavish. She provides relief and luxury, hence the Lequiaria for him. Dido falls in love with Aeneas, but Aeneas uses her help to recharge his batteries and leave because he has to found Rome. Bereaved, Dido kills herself, and in the future, Carthage and Rome go to war. Here we can add Dido to Cleopatra and Isolde of our list of tragic women who at least had a love story. But more in line with a game of chess theme, Dido, like Bianca and other women in this section, engages in civility only to get used for it. I do believe the connection is weaker in the case of Dido and Aeneas' story, because there are a lot of other factors in their story. For one, Aeneas didn't want to leave Dido. Still, a connection is there. We also have our degradation theme. Cleopatra has been reduced to some nameless woman in a dangerously over-perfumed room. We'll return to the room in a bit. With the degradation theme, Eliot takes something beautiful and makes it ugly, or he takes something that is ugly, are seen here in section 2, and describes it in beautiful language, or describes it as if it were beautiful. Contrast this with other poems on powder rooms, like Swift's The Progress of Beauty or The Lady's Dressing Room. Coincidentally, that Eliot is taking something ugly, a woman's powder room, and describing it as if it were beautiful is worth noting. In my previous video, I hinted at rhythm, how contrary to other poems, the wasteland is in sync with the beat of the times. I won't spend too much on free verse and music in the poem, mainly because I think it detracts from understanding the wasteland. Eliot's rhythms are what make the poem fresh and enjoyable to the ear, but this freshness is relevant to changes in his time as well. When we think of a poem, we think of a short literary piece written in verse. We don't think too much on verse or the different types of verse. Odds are we think of rhyme before verse, so much so we're less inclined to consider a poem if it doesn't have rhyme, or more inclined to consider a poem simply because it rhymes, even if it's not a good poem. Furthermore, some of you may have noticed this tacit standard when it comes to rhyme poetry and blank verse. If a poem rhymes, there's a lower standard, seemingly because the poem rhymes. But if a poem doesn't rhyme, there's a higher standard, seemingly because it doesn't rhyme, and the poem has to be of better quality because of this lack. Let's look at a poem, Blake's Poison Tree. I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. And I watered it with fears, night and morning with my tears, and I sunned it with smiles, and with soft deceitful wiles. And it grew both day and night, till it bore an apple bright, and my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine. And into the garden stole, when the night had veiled the pole. In the morning glad I see, my foe outstretched beneath the tree. I know I'm cherry-picking. Blake's poem is short and simple, yet this is similar to what we've come to expect in a poem, especially the rhyme. Eliot wasn't against rhyme. Like any good artist, he was against certain conventions, especially expectations of conventions in art. And rhyme was not an expectation, not an element employed for a poem's musicality. Here are some quotes from his essay, Reflections on Verse Libre. The English ear is or was more sensitive to the music of verse and less dependent upon the reoccurrence of identical sounds in this meter than in any other. There is no campaign against rhyme, but it is possible that excessive devotion to rhyme has thickened the modern ear. Rhyme removed, the poet is at once held up to the standards of prose. Rhyme removed, much ethereal music leaps up from the word, music which has hitherto chirped unnoticed in the expanse of prose. Eliot largely jettisons rhyme, but returns to and strengthens, rather reinvigorates, an expectation of a poem's musicality. Compare this with a poem of Eliot's time, Kilmer's Trees. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. There's no music here, yet in a way it's a reflection of the times, an older 1800s times, because the verse resembles a metronome, the machine, not music. Overtly, Eliot brought the gramophone, ragtime, popular music, opera, nursery rhymes, jazz rhythms, and even bird songs to the wasteland. Some of these elements aren't so new, but they're all brought in to bring musicality to poetry, in particular jazz, which was new in Eliot's time. There are jazz rhythms in the lines we've looked at so far in this video, and there'll be some in the other sections. It's all too easy to say that jazz's presence is a reflection of its times, yet someone had to be first in bringing this to poetry, a task that isn't easy, both being first and when rhyme was and still is an expectation in poetry. Finally, there's something more important that Eliot's doing. If we go back to our examples, the Blake and Kilmer poems, what we see are poems, largely as a result of the rhymes. One might even say that there being poems inhibits one from seeing what the poem is supposed to reveal. But what if one such as Eliot was deliberately unpoetic? Or as he says, to write poetry which should be essentially poetry, with nothing poetic about it, poetry standing naked in the bare bones, or poetry so transparent that we should not see the poetry, but that which we are meant to see through the poetry, poetry so transparent that in reading it, we are intent on what the poem joins at, and not on the poetry. This seems to me the thing to try for. In successfully dropping rhyme, I believe this is one of Eliot's strongest accomplishments. His poetry doesn't distract us by its being poetry. At times we can forget we're reading a poem. He still allows our experience to be enjoyable with his use of rhythms, yet he has us focus on the text meanings. Of note, he has a similar viewpoint with verse in theater. On the subject of Shakespeare's plays and their verse, he says, "No poet has begun to master dramatic verse until he can write lines which, like these in Hamlet, are transparent. You are consciously attending not to the poetry, but to the meaning of the poetry. If you were hearing Hamlet for the first time, without knowing anything about the play, I do not think it would occur to you to ask whether the speakers were speaking in verse or prose." Better still, when he returns to rhyme, such as in section 3, he accomplishes something quite new that's also a reflection of the times. Here's our next lines, 97 through 110. Above the antique mantle was displayed, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomel by the barbarous king so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug, jug to dirty ears. And other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, hushing the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the stair. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out in fiery points, glowed into words, then would be savagely still. Lines 94 to 96 lead us into a framed picture or wood carving. This picture we'll discover is one of many adorning this powder room/salon. The sylvan scene is a reference to Milton's Paradise Lost. In this Paradise Lost scene, Satan is looking in on Eden after having set his sights on tricky Eve. With ill intent, he will beguile her, and this action is something that should remind us of the reference for this section's title, Game of Chess, previously discussed. After the dolphin carving, we have the Philomela picture. If you're unfamiliar with Philomela's story from Ovid's Metamorphoses, you can easily look it up online or refer to your copy of The Wasteland for an explanation, if it offers one. For our purposes, I only look at Tereus, referred to rudely forced, and the story's conclusion. Notice the language Ovid uses for Tereus. The moment he saw the maiden, Tereus was inflamed with love, quick as if one should set fire to ripe grain, or dry leaves, or hay stored away in the mow. Her beauty indeed was worth it, but in this case his own passionate nature pricked him on, and besides the men of his clime were quick to love, his own fire and his nation's burnt in him. His impulse was to corrupt her attendant's care and her nurse's faithfulness, and even by rich gifts to tempt the girl herself, even at the cost of all his kingdom, or else to ravish her and to defend his act by bloody war. There was nothing which he would not do or dare. Smitten by his mad passion, his heart could scarce contain the fires that burnt in it. Tereus' attraction to Philomela is one of lust, not love. It's described in fire imagery, which in The Wasteland is a negative, and foreshadows section 3, the fire sermon. Finally, Tereus' lust is so strong that he would willingly risk his kingdom for the awful daring of a moment's surrender. Line 404. This is very different and even antithetical to the characters of Antony and Cleopatra, both who forsake their kingdoms for the sake of love. For the incident, we have all we need with the line rudely forced. Pertinent to this section, we should again be reminded of Milton's Women Beware Women. There also we have a patriarch make his moves onto an unsuspecting woman. There also we have the veneer of friendship, or good manners to mask a terrible act. Or in Ovid's story, Tereus pretends civility to his wife in order to trap Philomela. Finally, the story's conclusion. Philomela and characters are transformed into birds before Tereus can enact his revenge for Philomela's and Tereus' wife's revenge. FYI, Philomela becomes a nightingale. I'll return to the transformation in a moment. Notice the immediate series of contrasts, each one undermining the previous contrast in the following lines. So rudely forced, yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice,
and still she cried, and still the world pursues. We have the positive yet contrasting the negative reinforced, then negative all the desert contrasting the positive yet, and the positive inviolable contrasting the negative all the desert, finally the negative still the world pursues contrasting the positive inviolable voice. There are moments in which, despite Philomelo's situation, she found a way to triumph, but it turns out she sings in a desert, the desert a negative being dry, reminiscent of our fire symbol, or the state of the wasteland. Next her voice is described as inviolable, despite her having not been inviolable. She, now a bird, uses her song to still cry. In Ovid's story, Tereus took measures to keep her from telling her story, but the world still pursues, seemingly her or its lustful ways. We have this somewhat confirmed by the conclusion, jug, jug to dirty ears. Philomelo's story is something ugly, yet she is transformed into something beautiful, including her bird song. It doesn't fully succeed, however. At least, being in the wasteland, she's not in a setting in which beauty can carry over. She sings in a desert, which I liken to Tereus and his inflamed passions, but also infertility. Furthermore, despite her cries, the world pursues its ways, and her cries aren't heard for what they could be, something beautiful, but jug, jug. Jug, jug is an automatopoeia for the Nightingale song, but the to dirty ears reminds us, and certain editions of the Wasteland explain this, that it's slang for sexual intercourse. As opposed to providing a lesson, her song strengthens, to its lustful listeners, dirty tendencies of what happened to her in the first place. I do wonder if the Nightingale song can be beautiful in the wasteland. Or if we go back to our title, A Game of Chess, we have a terrible act described in terms of something not terrible, chess moves. Even if one could innocently hear the Nightingale song as beautiful, the songs that cover for a terrible act. I'll return to this in section 5. In any event, line 103 gives us the final say. Returning to our line setting, when we think on Philomelo's story, it's something at best insensitive to have framed in one salon, yet it's there. Now, this isn't something unique to the modern period. During the Renaissance, Lucretia was a popular figure for Renaissance painters. At least in the Renaissance, Lucretia's story served an ethos for its painters or the public. Or, to my point, people were familiar with her story. It's different in this salon because of the and other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Other lets us know there's more art, and notice the withered. Whatever art's displayed, it's old and has no relationship with its owner or the woman who's surrounded by it. I believe this salon, with artwork, as a room with artwork, serves as reminders for two literary works, the first being rather obvious, again Middleton's Women Beware Women. Before we have the chess scene, there's this exchange. Faith, madam, set these by. The gentlewoman, being a stranger, would take more delight to see your rooms and pictures. Very good, sir, and well prepared, I beseech you, show 'em her. That will beguile time well. Pray heartily do, sir. I'll do as much for you. Here, take these keys. Show her the monument, too, and that's a thing everyone sees not. You can witness that, widow. Bianca provides a tour of the art for Guardiano, but he isn't there to see the artwork. It's not a cultural exchange. Regardless of whatever art's there, we only see the monument, the Duke. This is similar to the salon in section 2. Whatever art is there, we only see the barbarous king. For those who use the Northern Critical edition of The Wasteland, scholars like I. Richards and Mebius note Eliot being a poet of compression, leaving much out. Yet for those familiar to the lines his texts are drawn from, or could be drawn from, it allows for a much more expansive experience. So when I read lines 97 to 106, I also think of the Fairy Queen, Book 3, Canto 11. If anyone listening to this has read the Fairy Queen cover to cover, post your W in the comments. In Canto 11, Britomart making her way through the House of Israel, where she finds rooms depicting love on their walls. Besides the rooms, here's the fire and gold, similar to what we've seen in our Section 2 salon. The first room is the true love room. Then she gets a warning, be bold, before going to the next room, which is the destructive love room. Then she gets another warning, be not too bold. As for these scenes relevant to the wasteland, Britomart has a relationship to the artwork. Even the destructive love evokes a response from her. Again, not so for our nameless woman. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, pushing the room and closed. In my opinion, is an underappreciated line. Now, let's get this out of the way first. I think Section 2 so far has been influenced by another modernist poet, Conrad Aiken. Aiken and Eliot were friends, and Aiken published Nocturne on Remembered Spring and other poems years before Eliot published The Wasteland. Notice, no, you are Cleopatra, fiercely young, laughing upon the topmost stair of night. Roses upon the desert must be flung. It is your wish above us, light by light, weaves the delirious darkness, petals fall. They fall upon your jeweled hands, they tremble upon your hair. lean with the leaning bow in arrested pain. Spring is also relevant in Aiken's poems. Aiken's poems have a wonderful musicality to them, something that probably influenced Eliot, yet how much is impertinent. But if you like The Wasteland and you're looking for something similar to read next, I'd recommend Aiken before anyone else. Second, The Wasteland is a nightmarish poem, and there are big lines that drive this home, but also the more subtle ones. When it says staring forms, it's as if whoever's there aren't even human but humanoid. They're simply forms, devoid of characteristics or history. Now, is this referring to the figures in the art or people? The staring forms coming after Wallace makes me believe it's the art, but the following leaned out makes me believe it's people. Regardless, it gets worse with leaned out leaning. Normally, redundancy is bad, but here it produces a wonderful effect. This banal action is what we get to know them by, along with the hush their staring and leaning produces. The footsteps of someone leaving, it's most likely not the nameless woman, but her lover or SO, because she's presumably fixing her hair. That, however, the SO leaves without a goodbye does not paint whoever the SO is and her in a good light. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair, spread out in fiery points, flowed into words, then would be savagely still. It's as if the hairstyle is demonic, like Medusa, or something from the 1980s. I doubt Eliot intended for us to have Medusa in mind, but if true, notice the progression of women so far in this section. We go from Cleopatra to Philomela to Medusa. Cleopatra, a tragic love story, Philomela, a bad love story, and Medusa, unlovable. Our next lines. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you're thinking. Think. I think we're in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. This is a beginning dialogue between a woman and a man, presumably a couple. At the time of its publication, speaking in terms of nerves was novel. People in the 1800s didn't speak or think in terms of their nerves being bad. It's very modern. So she's in a bad way and looks to her partner, who's only there bodily, for support. There's an irony when he says, where the dead men lost their bones. In the wasteland, even in death, there's no peace, because your remains are disturbed or carried away by rats. The rat is an appropriate image. When we think of city life animals, we think pigeon, rat, sometimes pigeon rat. More importantly, in the West, the rat is a symbol of disease and death. If life is in decay in the wasteland, it makes sense that there would be rats, or that they would thrive. The next lines read, what is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing, again nothing. You know nothing. You see nothing. You remember nothing. I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But, oh, that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent. In my previous video I mentioned how any one of the four elements is not absolutely good. Each have negative connotations, but some more naturally so than others. So far the appearance of wind in line 89 was good. There's the other side of wind, however, especially in religious literature. I think I've touched enough on the religious symbolism in my previous video, and there's a lack of it in section 2, so I'll only share some quotes on screen now. In its negative meaning, wind is a symbol of destruction and futility. For the lines we're looking at, Eliot references Webster's The Devil's Law case. This line reminded me of Othello in a similar scene which I'll share. Seeing all a green willow must be my garland, let nobody blame him, his scorn I approve. Nay, that's not next. Hark, who is it that knocks? It's the wind. Subconsciously, Desdemona has a foreboding sense of her soon-to-be death, which is depicted as wind knocking at the door. The exchange of our two characters in the poem is very one-sided yet surprising. The woman with her nerves and concerns appears the more normal of the two. In contrast, the man is more like an automaton. He says these lines, which are responses to her questions, and even in answering them, he's not technically in the wrong. She asks him, what are you thinking? What's that noise? What's the wind doing? What do you remember? And so on. Yet the matter-of-factness of his response is devoid of personality, like an automaton, and lacks concern for her concerns. Surprise on his part has two extremes, the high culture and low culture references. Despite his dead-in-life state, he remembers those are pearls that were his eyes, a reference to Shakespeare's The Tempest, and uses as evidence that the man is the quester, for this line was told to whoever Madame Sosostris was speaking to. What does it mean that he remembers this? In contrast to everything else so far, this line is something rich and strange, not to mention a water allusion, all told in song. Ariel sings, Full fathom 5, thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made, those of pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him doth fade, but doth suffer of sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell. However, with the butt at line 127, this relapses, or rather switches to the Shakespearean rag, a popular embodied ragtime song in Eliot's time. In my interpretation, the quester tried to keep to the Shakespeare reference, a positive, but as in the Nightingale song, it can't keep from perversion. When someone hears the bird song, he or she thinks of Tereus. When someone thinks of Shakespeare in the wasteland, or in the wasteland's time, he or she now thinks of the rag. Our next lines: what shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down, so what shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? The hot water at 10, and if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door. The now is her coming to her senses to the fact that whoever she's with is of no help to her. The as I am gives us immediacy, that she's getting out even if she, unprepared, has to get out right now. The hair down should remind us of the Hyacinth Girl scene. There, however, it could be interpreted positively. There was recognition from her SO based on the Hyacinth Girl speech. Yet this woman isn't resolved to leave the wasteland, even if it means leaving unprepared and alone, for she starts speaking in we. The man is still oblivious,
responding like a human timetable, thus mechanistically, to her and her concerns.
Notice his responses have been entirely in keeping with civility. The hot water at 10, that if it rains a closed car at 4, that we shall play a game of chess, and waiting for a knock upon the door. It could have been possible that his waiting for a knock upon the door wasn't meant ominously, except for the pressing lidless eyes. The imagery here is like that of statues, hence not like the living. He means the knock literally, but it also means something else. Whether it does so consciously or subconsciously is difficult to say.
We haven't looked at why the woman is in a bad state. She seems at a loss as to what to do with herself. If we ask ourselves, what do modern people in the city do? We have two answers based on this scene. The first, activities, like the list of dull things at 135, 139. They're all civilized things that a civilized person would do in early 20th century Europe. Yet like the Stinson had at line 69, they're simply empty signs. Second, based on interpreting a knock upon the door ominously, is death. People in the city wait for death. Why is this the case? Two things. First, the 1920s. The time of the Wasteland's publication was the lost generation, in which people experienced a sense of disorientation and directionlessness. Figures like Darwin, Nietzsche, Freud, Einstein, etc. had dismantled age-old Western belief systems, hence disorientation and directionlessness. It's more complex than this, of course. Second, and unique to the poem, in line 136 we have, if it rains, a closed car at 4. It's a return to the fertility ritual significance. At the animal level, to be cut off from water is to be cut off from life. But there's also water spiritualism. If we don't take water entirely literally, instead for what it symbolizes, modern life here in the city is cut off from a spiritual reality. Worse, at line 136 there's volition, the choice to cut oneself off from water, even when it happens in the city. And notice, the shelter is civilization, a closed car. People wait for death, like the people in section 1, the burial of the dead, because they are so cut off from what gives life, or cut themselves off from what gives life.
The next lines: when Lil's husband got the moth, I said, I didn't mince my words. I said to her myself, hurry up please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back, make yourself a bit smart. I want to know what you've done with that money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. He did, I was there. You looked them all out, Lil, and get a nice set. He said, I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said. And think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years, he wants a good time. And if you don't give it to him, there's others will, I said. Who is there, she said. Something like that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and gave me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. Now we're at a low-end pub. The hurry up, please, it's time is closing call. We have a woman speaking about her so-called friend, Lil, to someone else, unheard, unseen. The woman's speech is regarding Lil's husband, who was recently released from the military, so is back in civilian life. Apparently Lil's looks have gone downhill. Worse, Lil's friend, our speaker, with her I didn't mince my words, and no more can't I, there's others that will, isn't helping, but instead tearing her down in a backhanded way. As we'll discover, Lil is still relatively young, so that she has to get herself some teeth is ironic. 31 is not an age where a woman thinks about replacing her teeth. She's old in youth, and as we'll discover, she's still expected to look young. Also, I believe this loss of teeth ties into the loss of bones at line 116. When we die, our bones are all we have left, or is all that is left of us. In the wasteland, we can't even be guaranteed our teeth in our youth, nor our bones in our deaths. At the end here, the straight look is suggestive that Lil is onto the speaker. The conversation should remind us of a game of chess. On the surface, it's civil, but only mechanistically. There's an ulterior motive, the speaker really being after Lil's husband. Also notice the degradation of an even only gilded image. The chess title at the beginning, to the gilded salon room, to the rat's alley, to now in the pub, not even any guild, just low-end pub life. The next lines, if you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't, but if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique. And her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's the pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already, nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? Hurry up, please, it's time. We find out the reason Lil's looks have gone south is that she's had 5 abortions. Given that Albert's been in the army for 4 years, and we never find out what that money was used for, it's possible that she's been unfaithful. As for the relevance, the pills were used to destroy the consequences of love. Sex, really, along with the corpse in the garden, line 71 to 74. Line 100's rudely forced. It's all sterile. No rebirth, no love, no reproduction, including what you get married for if you don't want children. Go back to line 148, the speakers. He wants a good time. No rekindling, no love, no reproduction, only sex, which in comparison with love is sterile. The speaker's more concerned about Albert's sex life than she is Lil's, who is supposed to be her, the speaker's, friend. The bartender's last call now takes on a more ominous meaning. It reminds me of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. The line, it gave us both a feeling as though something were hurrying us, and we could not lose any time together, which is an allusion to Marvel's To His Quiet Mistress, which Eliot will also use. I don't believe Eliot's message is as simple as time is running out for Lil to have a baby, instead that she's running out of time altogether. For example, she's already losing her skeleton. There's an essay by Langbaum on the wasteland called The Walking Dead, and our speaker's conversation and the previous dialogue between the quester and his SO seems like a perfect fit for the last 2/3 of this section. The next lines, well, that Sunday Albert was home and they had a hot gammon, and they asked me to dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. More irony. The speaker has been tearing down her unattractive friend, who the speaker should be helping, yet the speaker is friendly enough to beautify Lil's ham for dinner. It's dehumanizing, yet consistent with the wasteland's nightmarish world. I want to fit in one more chess reference before the final lines. In this section, civility hasn't been a positive aspect of human relations. It's worse than false, it's conniving. At best, it's been phoning it in. Yet with the Tempest reference at line 137, I wonder if Eliot also meant to draw our attention to this scene, given section 2's title. My dukedom, since you have given me again, I will requite you with as good a thing, at least bring forth a wonder to content ye, as much as me, my dukedom. Here Prospero delivers Ferdinand and Miranda playing at chess. Sweet lord, you play me false. No, my dear Slav, I would not for the world. Yes, for a score of kingdoms you should wrangle, and I would call it fair play. This prove a vision of the island, one dear son shall I twice lose. In Shakespeare's play, Prospero goes behind his enemy's back to render him, Alonso, a good. He treats his enemy like a friend, despite it being within Prospero's power to destroy him. Yes, there's a political stratagem. Prospero wants his kingdom back, but this is another story. Compare this with Tereus and Philomela, our speaker and Lil, each relation in which a friend is treated like an enemy. Also in the play, the chess game is healthy. Yes, it's also Prospero metaphorically revealing his stratagem to get his kingdom back. But there's nothing else, certainly nothing negative, behind the chess game. We go from reveal to chess. In Middleton's play, and in section 2, we go from chess to reveal. Also, there's no false, and there is fair play in the dialogue between Miranda and Ferdinand. Finally, our last lines. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night. Ta-ta. Good night. Good night. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night. It looks like our speaker leaves, but there are 2 speakers. Contrast the informal good night and ta-ta with the last lines, with their absence of this speech type. Who's the final speaker? Anyone who knows his or her Hamlet will recognize these as Ophelia's last lines before she drowns. The poem has given us another tragic love woman: Isolde, Cleopatra, Dido, and now the fair Ophelia. As to why the lines here, my guess is that it's actually Lil who speaks the lines. She's been at the pub and has overheard all her friend has said behind her back. Most likely Lil doesn't say these lines knowing she's going out like Ophelia, but it's a sign to us that she is. These lines, along with "those are pearls that were his eyes," are the only two beautiful lines in this section, and coincidentally enough, they both have to do with water, our healthy life symbol.
Yet despite their connections to water, these lines are still connected with death, so water isn't so clear-cut. There's another layer for which we have to remember the context of line 55 and section 4. This concludes this video's look at section 2. Next time we'll look at section 3, the fire sermon. If you found this video helpful to your understanding of the wasteland, please consider giving it a like and joining me next time.